for a number of reasons. But first, I want to talk to you about this Supreme Court decision. I think it was shocking to a number of Americans that there were some 20 plus states in the United States where you could still be fired for being gay or being suspected of being LGBT or Q. But it was something, I mean, often the Supreme Court cases get announced in June. So it's not as if the Pride calendar and the Supreme Court decision calendar were all lined up. But this isn't the first time that's happened. What was your reaction when you heard the news on Monday about the decision of the justices?
Absolutely. I was absolutely shocked because, as you know, most of us in the LGBT community were really on pins and needles because we now have a very conservative court. So this was a pleasant and shocking surprise. And to have Gorsuch, who is a Trump appointee, is sort of a slap. But I really feel that we're seeing even a pivot with the court because it was 6-3. It wasn't one of these sort of hairline decisions here. So, I don't know how much the moment that we're in with COVID and Black Lives Matter movement, or so much has to do with the fact that Gorsuch is very much a textualist. So there was nothing to really argue and equivocate about in reading that decision.
Yeah, I know that when I was an activist back in the 1990s and volunteering with the Human Rights Campaign, we often used to do surveys and find that most Americans didn't want LGBTQ people fired from work if they were showing up for their job, and it didn't make sense in a fair-minded America that you should be fired simply for your sexual orientation. And I'm wondering what you think the significance of this is. I know that the roadmap, if there could be a roadmap, used to be, well, if we can have protections at work, people will get to know gay people, and then we can look at marriage. But of course, it went reverse. But how important is it today that this ruling comes out to protect LGBTQ Americans from being fired at work?
Listen, this is unbelievable in a Trump administration. But let's not fool ourselves. This is not going to be an easy rollout in terms of the application of it, because your religious right very much are going to argue against it, particularly institutions that are religious institutions. If you're going to a religious school, or if someone says, my religion prohibits me. We've seen this with what is it, the masterpiece cake
Yep.
decision. Yeah. So it's wonderful. It's important that it's in the book, on the books, but I mean the rollout of that is going to continue now as it hits the ground to be a kind of contentious, fight.
I'm talking with Reverend Irene Monroe here on Lunch Hour Live. If you have some comments or questions for Reverend Irene, just put them in the comments section and they'll make their way to me, and we can hopefully bring your question to Irene and to have some more scintillating conversation that Irene and I are famous for having together. If not on the air, at least on our cell phones from time to time. All right. So the thing about this too was you're talking about the battles that happen. Like, a lot of folks, because they have lives, don't pay attention to the Supreme Court. When something happens, and the Supreme Court rules in one way or another, you said there's still battles to be fought, but can you speak a little bit more specifically about the world of religion and how the challenge as an openly lesbian reverend working in the religious world for just about your entire life, what are some of the challenges that you face and that you see others face being openly gay?
Well, first of all, one of which is that all life is of equal worth. Okay, we are not children of a lesser God. That's number one. So the battle in the church, and as we speak today, the Methodist Church is about to split. But I'm hoping that with this going on, that they with us in many ways having to sit still, there'll be some discernment as we talk about Black Lives Matter, that perhaps they'll understand that LGBTQ lives matter too, and particularly with this Supreme Court, Court decision here. But the battle really will be, if you go to an employee and they will if they discern you're gay, and oh my God, if you're transgendered, it's still going to continue to be a battle. It just reminds me of Brown versus Board of Education when we were trying to desegregate schools. I mean, we're still trying to desegregate school, and that was the decision in 1954. So here we are at 2020. But I'm
Right, and the
hopeful.
thing
I mean,
that folks don't get about that decision is that what happened was a lot of the African American kids got to go to schools, but the Black teachers were fired. So
that's
the
right.
African American kids went to schools with white teachers, and Black teachers were fired, and that didn't, moved us forward a little bit, but there are always people putting up obstacles to stop the forward progress. I wanted to, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and you and I are old enough to have been to enough Boston LGBTQ pride celebrations and meetings and marches, and the exclusion of recognition for Black and African American members of the LGBTQ community has been longstanding and continues to be a challenge. And this year is the 50th anniversary of the Boston Pride celebration, and it brought up a lot of tensions within the LGBTQ community. And you've written quite eloquently about it, both for the Boston Globe and for Bay Windows and for other publications. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know folks look at the rainbow, they look at the folks who turn out for Pride, and they go, that's the way the world should be, some people say, but it's fraught with a lot of challenges.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When June is Pride Month, and so what revs up for us as LGBTQ people really are the fault lines of race, class, and gender. That has been historic. It has been for 50 years, if you're looking particularly within the Boston context. The very, very interesting thing is what has happened over the years. There have been, because of this kind of tension, you have the Dyke March, you have the Latinx Pride, you have the Black Pride, largely because we're not included in terms of the planning of the event. We're always kind of pimped for photo op moments to sort of highlight diversity, but yet don't have any decision making, power. And so this year was particularly interesting. Again, in some ways, a rather disingenuous effort by many pride events across the country, because of Black Lives Matter, the Black trans community was able to come out, but they've been trying very hard to have a particular place within this movement. So we had a march last Saturday here in Boston, but I see this as an anemic sort of token effort to seize the moment, and it's symbolic, but it has really no substance and policy changes. So, moving forward as we move to year 51, 2021, is to really see, does Pride get it? But equally as important, does America get it? That all Black lives matter. And the
There
very
were,
interesting, go ahead.
no, you
I
go
was going to
ahead.
say the very interesting thing about Pride in particular, when we go back to 1969, which I was in that in that riot the first night, is has a lot to do with the fact that the Stonewall Inn, the bar there, was a Black and brown working class, bar, and that the drag queens were Black and brown people. So what happens with our attention within our community has a lot with how that narrative continues to bleach out and whitewash the principal players in that movement. And so we've seen a movie that came out, I think 2015 or
Mhm.
whatever, and you would go like, really, did this, I mean, just talk about fictive and revisionist history. So part of it is that the dominant white LGBT community controls that narrative. It's an opportunity now to really correct that narrative. So I mean, an area opportunity where actually Black and Latinx LGBT people are really there in the historic moment, we get bleached out.
We have a question coming to us from the social media, reminding folks, thanks for watching Lunch Hour Live with us. If you have a question, you can leave it in the comments. And I want to reframe this a little bit. The question is, why does it seem like various groups are now competing with each other to get equality rather than working together? And I also want to add on to this. I saw a tweet, I think Representative Ayanna Pressley retweeted it over the week, that said just by the fact that we're saying that someone needs to be invited to the table is an opportunity to point out that who owns the table, right? You know, that if are we saying you join us, or is this an opportunity to the poster's question that maybe we can get rid of the table and build a new way of doing things? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. What we lack really is really an intersectional approach here, because the very interesting thing when you look at the Black community and the LGBT community, a community that I intersect and continues to break my heart in the way in which we are not allies, but we have a very shared history of violence and police brutality, starting certainly with the Stonewall riot. The interesting thing too, it really bothers me because a lot of what the LGBTQ community has done, and and I'm talking about the white community because we were not at the table, is that they have really used the Black civil rights playbook of the 1960s to catapult their agenda. I mean, when we look at marriage equality, that's Mildred Loving versus the Commonwealth of Virginia. We use that to get marriage equality. Even when we look at the recent Supreme Court decision, that's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So again, you would think that we would be staunch allies, in this struggle for equality for all of us as Americans. But again, issues of white privilege comes in, issue of entitlement, and Ayanna Pressley was right. We got to get rid of the table. And what I like about Black Lives Matter, their sort of structure is non-hierarchical. So in that, it's that, everyone has an equal sort of interest in, moving forward this agenda about equality.
So if we were going to say that, 2020 here, this is the year we've been actually waiting for, right? So this is all the work everyone is doing. Unfortunately, there's a big cost to pay to get to this year between COVID-19 and the historical abuse of African Americans and Black people in our nation. But here we are, and we're tossing the table. What would it look like? What would a fully inclusive and diverse Pride, both in Boston and across the country, what would it look like to you?
Well, it's very, very interesting. It would be the inclusion of us at the table to help bring a much more colorful Pride event. So, several places have tried that, like Philadelphia, and I think this was 2017. And one of the things they wanted to do with the Pride flag was to add black and brown to the flag, and a whole kerfuffle and ensued here. But I think that in order to have that work of the reality of a more inclusive Pride, we really got to understand that the table is owned by whites. So the work of doing anti-racist training has to be done by the folks that are hold the table. So we really got to deconstruct and the notion that yes, you are, meaning whites, you are definitely oppressed by heterosexism, but it's your white privilege that even allows certain laws to be passed. Because the truth of the matter is that the reason why the LGBTQ movement has moved much faster in trying to get laws passed than the Black community is because there are white people there. Absolutely. I'll give you a classic example. The day that George Floyd's first homegoing took place, and that was in Minneapolis, the Senate was trying to pass an anti-lynching bill. Now, this is a bill that we've been trying to pass since the 1950s. And so it didn't get passed. But interestingly enough, as we speak today, we have evidence of two African American men being lynched and in California. It's that kind of stuff. They don't, the lack of an intersectional kind of coalition and allyship prohibits the kind of what we call a much more multicultural and, participatory democracy.
I want to talk to you about the challenge that I think all prides have, and a lot of organizations, movements that become organizations have, is that in order to do the work that people are expecting of them, they need the money to be able to do that. And one of the ways they get money is from corporate sponsorship and from parade and from
Right.
all of those things that bring the money in. And this is, not just Pride. It's the St. Patrick's Day parade. It's the parade in your town.
That's
I
right.
mean, this is the model for how things go. And as LGBTQ rights and equality has moved forward, there was a year, I think, not long ago, 10 years ago in Pride, where we went from a lot of sexual content, if you will, overtly sexual content in the parade. And then the next year it was all bankers, Montessori schools, right? So where's the balance? How do you see the balance between engaging corporate partners to not just give lip service, but also hopefully to communicate with them, to help them make meaningful changes within their companies, but also staying true to some of the roots and other expressions within the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Sue. You're absolutely right. I mean, I don't want us to lose the corporate money and participation. We got to understand that some of our LGBTQ folks work for these organizations, and that's important to know that they back their employees. But I think that we can have their support without all of the corporate sort of display that we see. But I think the reason for that is that we don't mesh it together in terms of these are the core principles from the beginning, from 1969, that needs to always be front and center of our organization as we become more expansive in terms of including corporations. So it becomes a kind of flashy show, and because it becomes so corporate, it definitely make brown and black folks and other marginalized folks within our community non-essentials, except again if you want that photo op moment.
I know that my friends that are on the Pride Committee and folks that I've worked with for many years, it's a lot of work. I know that
Oh
very
yeah.
often a lot of them are trying to get off the board because it's a 365-day a year job. No one is ever happy with them, both on small issues and important issues. And so I'm wondering, I'm sure, they won't, I know they would welcome more input and more involvement. And I know that there are just institutional barriers that keep people from being involved. What's your message to the Pride Committee, and what's your message to people watching who want more participation and want more representation, but also may not have the time, ability, or finances to volunteer to the degree that is needed to make these events happen? Or should they just stop doing big events?
No, I don't think they should, but I think this, in terms of the Pride Committee, I think the things they don't do is they don't cast a wider net in terms of people of color. I've never been asked, and I'm pretty, fairly well known within the community. I understand it takes a lot of time. Some of us have the time, okay? So it wouldn't be a strain. But, again, I don't think that they really comb through the community wide enough to find folks who would love to be on the committee. So it sort of reminds me, when a corporation is looking for someone and they say, well, we just can't find the black folks. And it's like, yeah, we're here. Okay, you just didn't cast a wide enough net to catch us. So I think that's one of the things that, the Pride Committee has to do. And the point is that even if I couldn't be on the committee, I can give them a whole bunch of folks that would say, oh, sure, I'll do it.
Talk to me about what you're feeling right now at this point in our nation's history. I mean, it is both horrifying to watch the news in terms of the impact that COVID-19 is having on communities of color and on Blacks and African Americans. And it's also, I can't even imagine what it must feel like to see people for the first time understand the violence that has been just been put upon Black people for hundreds of years. I know that
Yeah,
you have a sort of forgiving saying that, if you didn't know, you can almost be forgiven, but once you do know, you
no,
have to take
that's
action,
right.
right?
Right.
What, how are you feeling as you're watching all of these cauldrons just sort of emerge and bubble over?
Well, so I see this as a third Reconstruction. So what do I mean by that? The first Reconstruction was after the Civil War. And so we got like what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which, freed us, made us citizens, you know, and allowed, certain people to have access to the ballot, but not really. Then the second Reconstruction was the Black Civil Rights Movement. And what I mean by that, we got 1964, we the Civil Rights Act, we got the Voting Rights Act. So we got a number of amendments that made us more inclusive, less of a second class citizen. I see this as a third Reconstruction. I'm sorry that it's at the time of a of a pandemic, but some say maybe it took that to happen. But what I see is like this recent Supreme Court decision. That's important. That as the browning of America takes place, as more of us have come out of the closet since 1969, the Stonewall riot, we are seeing the demand for a much more, as I say, participatory democracy that includes many more people. But power is always what it is. They're not, the folks in power are not going to say, here, just take it. We have to wrestle for it, and it's important to have a fair and balanced Supreme Court. So I see this as a third Reconstruction, even though I think it's kind of anemic in terms of how many whites are now supposedly symbolically stepping up to include Black Lives Matter. What I'm hoping is that now we can hold people to their promise to be more inclusive, and what will happen is that we need more legislation to be passed to secure not only that all Black lives matter, but all marginalized people like Native Americans. It's interesting how we're taking down these Confederate monuments and statues, but we still have a lot of Native American ones. There's still this kind of kerfuffle going on about Christopher Columbus statue. We have an NFL team that's called the Redskins. So I'm hoping that this will be a moment not of re-examining the sort of historical damage of white supremacy and their iconic images like Robert E. Lee,
Yeah,
Christopher
I want to ask you.
Columbus.
I want to ask you a question about the broadening of that, because it's been fascinating to me also on Twitter to watch conversations. I think there was a hashtag trending over the weekend that trans Black Lives Matter, and I think there was, I don't want to say pushback, but some discussion about, well, we're not changing Black Lives Matter to broaden it. It should be broad enough to include all Black lives, right? So I'm wondering about the groups within the groups and how representation and advocacy would look like for, as you say, for Native Americans looking to also make sure that they are noted and previous wrongs are at least acknowledged and addressed.
Right. So you're asking what would that look like?
Yeah.
What we need to do here? Well, I mean that that's the whole thing, because your point is your question is very important, because then what you have within various marginalized group is competition, right? Competition. So what we have to really do here is that I really feel that now that Black Lives Matter is in this moment in time, that they need to be more expansive in terms of their messaging, that they need to talk about how Native Americans, and we need that coalition, but we don't have that because we actually do have folks who are Black and Native American, you know. So I'm just hoping that as we kind of sputter out, because I think we're sputtering out, at this moment, that the dialogue, many more people of different marginalized groups will certainly, become front and center. But I need to say this about why Black trans lives needed to sort of have a platform, and I was very glad that they had it Saturday, is because we have a history, meaning African American, of being virulently homophobic. Not that we have a patent on it, but we definitely have a problem with it. And so it brings to the fore a group that still continues, even as we speak today. You know, during the time that George Floyd we were rallying around the murder of George Floyd. Two Black trans women had been killed, and they're disproportionately killed than any marginalized group within the LGBT community. So it has to be about that. Again, all lives are of equal worth, and of news should be. So that was it. We tend to just focus just on one particular group. And what happens even when we just look at how police, brutality impacts Black men, we ignore, how Black women are impacted. We only can think of, right now, Breonna Taylor, or maybe, Sandra Bland, but a lot of Black women are impacted by police brutality. My spouse being one of them, constantly, and we live in liberal Cambridge, the People's Republic of Cambridge.
I understand. We're going to have to save that one, sadly, for another time. But Reverend Irene Monroe, it's good to see you as always, my friend. Happy Pride to you.
I miss you. Happy Pride to you as well.
I miss you too. I'll see you in person soon. Thanks, everybody, for watching another edition of Lunch Hour Live here at WGBH. We'll be back again. Stay tuned and keep watching, and stay safe and wear your mask and wash your hands.